Now we're going to turn it over to you. I promised that we would have time for questions, so we have about 15 minutes for the panel discussion. So instructions for those in the room. If you have questions for any of our panelists here, please raise your hand and one of the Housing for Health staff will come to you with a mic so that everyone can hear you. For online attendees, please type your questions into the chat box. And the chat box will be monitored by the Housing for Health staff and passed along either to myself or you guys can read them aloud. So we'll open it up for discussion. Who has a question for the panelists? I'm seeing a hand, number 1, number 2. Oh dear, number 3, and then we'll go to an online question after those 3, if that's okay. I think I pointed here.
Thank you. Thanks for your presentations. Linking some of the earlier conversation with what we just saw in Vulcan. I'm just curious, if we value things, we measure them. Are any of you aware, is it being done or should it be done? Looking at utilization of the typical park space. You know, in the cities, but also in the suburban communities and smaller places like Vulcan. You know, it seems like it's a sort of an underutilized space a lot of the time, and like has been done in other context, I guess. You know, are people sort of collecting data around actual utilization of these kinds of spaces? Could it be used to encourage kind of different solutions when new developments are happening, and the back and forth between developers and you know, urban planners?
You're free to, whoever wants to take it on first, and if there's multiple, go ahead.
I can go. I guess from a City of Edmonton perspective, I know, because Daniel showed some really good stats from the utilization of our bike facilities that we put in. I don't work in the parks section, so I can't clearly state that we have done that, but I think we have done in some of the newer ones that we've created recently, especially if they're adjacent to rec centers. So we obviously know how many people are visiting those rec centers. And I guess, you know, it's great that like, some of the rec centers that we have do have a lot of, you know, people visiting them. Some of the new parks we've put in, definitely there's a lot of utilization of them. But I would continue to argue that we would get a heck of a lot more if we actually connected our communities, right? So that's what you know, the discussion, both myself and Daniel were talking about, and others here, it's about connecting all those things together without having to drive all the time, right? And so if we start utilizing the many great spaces that we already have and the many great facilities that both, you know, Calgary, Edmonton, and other towns and cities throughout the province have, if we can design I always talk about the accessible journey, something that I learned in New Zealand, which is a great theory that I'm hoping that we can adopt in Canada as well. And what it basically talks about is that you can go anywhere you want throughout your community without having to rely on anybody else to take you there, right? So for instance, somebody with a mobility issue, right now in the city of Edmonton, they take DATS, which is they have to call up a day or two before and say, oh, I have an appointment, or I want to go to a facility, I want to go to the rec center. Not the most convenient, right? So that's because a lot of our built environment is so poorly built. So if we can improve those things, I think the existing parks and facilities that we have will be utilized a heck of a lot more. I'll let others chat because I can go on for hours.
I feel like we could go for a coffee and then it'll be like the next day. So for us at the City of Calgary, we are collecting data. So one of the examples I showed was a picture of West Eau Claire Park, which we completed in 2018. And so we continue the contract with our consultant, and we asked them to understand how did our design impact the usability of the area. And it was also important to collect data and information to advance our operational department to say, hey, pavers, they actually work. If you build it this way, you can widen our palettes, for example, to bring color and to bring texture and some of those other key elements that create good urban design. So we've been starting to do that with our projects. I think one of the other pieces that's important with data that I've learned through our Main Streets Metric program is you can always go back and collect data. And so when you're looking at sensors, maybe that one is a little bit trickier because you can't set them up in 10 years ago. But if you're looking at mobile data, you're able to then extract maybe how users were, where they were coming from, how often they were coming, and how long they were staying. And so there is that opportunity. For us at the city, we typically then go out for procurement, and we would seek the best consultants to kind of gather that information and generate that report. And so I think one of the things I can share is that we're hoping to share publicly our Main Street Streetscape Master Plan metrics program. And with that, there are pieces I think that you can extract and use them to better understand parks, because parks are part of our public system, public realm that we need to connect. And then the other area that we've also engaged in a consultant is when we're looking at an area redevelopment plan. And so we started to understand in our established communities and also in our downtown, is there a shortage of open space? So when you build new communities, we have guidelines as to the percentage of allocation. And so in theory, how much space does a person have? And we're finding that in some of our established communities and in our downtown, there's a deficiency in that space. And the pandemic kind of highlighted that. And so that is also something that we are looking for to expand on. So currently, right now, the City of Calgary is looking to update our open space plan and include that metrics component. But I don't believe we'll have any intel or information available for maybe another year or two.
Okay, I think we're going to move, if that's okay, to an online question. My apologies. I know I said in the room, but I want to make sure that we bounce back and forth. So if somebody from the Housing for Health team could read out a question, doesn't need to be transcribed. Is there a question online? Oh, you're going to make me read it. I'm trying to. Oh dear. Got a computer and everything. Okay. Challenging my eyesight here. Okay, policies and design guides are great for setting some direction, but I really liked what Sophie had to say about street level visioning, being intentional, taking action, reevaluating, and adapting to achieve our collective vision. With this in mind, how are we lending a voice to Calgary and Edmonton neighborhoods who may not be as vocal or engaged and possibly less affluent? Anyone want to take that on? Sophie.
I can kick us off, and then I'm sure others are going to chime in. So I think we're in a time and age where we are more connected and more disconnected at the same time. But one positive thing with our digital era is that data collection has become more accessible and easier to be done distributed as well. So in terms of also just going back to the previous question, in terms of understanding the needs and desires of local communities, that has become more accessible. It's become easier to engage with people out in communities. And I think, even our work in Calgary, we learned when we were doing public engagement in phase 1, we had fewer people show than when we were at the end of phase 1, mid-COVID, and everything was online because people felt, more inclined to join. They could do it from their own homes, on their own time, from communities that weren't right next to City Hall necessarily. So I think data collection in that sense and public input has become more equitable over COVID. So that's like a positive outcome of COVID. I think in terms of, really engaging at street level, at eye level, there's an importance in presence and also being together in person to get more of that sort of nuance and feel and experience layer onto our sort of design and policy layers. And oftentimes, I think, we as professionals fail to do that in a way where we actually harness the local creativity in our projects. And so for us at Gale, it's really important that we are out in the communities, working directly with communities to enact on the change process that they want to see directly through the input we get from them. And to do that, it's really about developing tools for that engagement. And one of the things that we've learned over the years is that if you focus on the experience and provide people with, ideas and sentiments around what could that be instead of should it be, like the classic thing, do you want a green bike lane or a blue bike lane? Well, maybe that's not exactly the root of what the change they want to see is. So we actually go out like way earlier and talk a lot more about experience, what kind of place do you want to be with local communities, and oftentimes through organizations that have local connections and are trusted members of the local communities. So I think we're in a time now where that has become increasingly more important, but also increasingly more accessible because people are also really care about their local communities and see the need for having thriving, healthy communities in a different way than I think people did before COVID, because we're living more local as forced by COVID.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more question, so we'll move to who had their hand up next? Sorry. And I know that this, I hope, I'm not sure who all is going to be around tomorrow, but maybe, connect when kind of during some of the breaks and things. Okay, we're passing over here. Go ahead, please. And state your name. And the person online didn't have a name associated with their question. So thank you for your question, person online. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I'm Zara from Housing for Health project. So my question comes from my background in brand design and also what we experience in this project and involved in the different neighborhoods. So I'm gonna ask you this question based on the City of Calgary or City of Edmonton experiences and urban design guideline. To what extent that these two cities are trying to connect the main street guidelines to the neighborhood, that to character of the neighborhood, to create an integrated, network of open spaces, corridors, and these types of spaces. Thank you. And one more question from Sophie. Oh, yeah. One more question from Sophie. Based on the Stefan Avenue project and experience, and based on what the best practices in the world we already have, does this project have any public engagement, workshops in terms of the furniture design, or does this project have any monitoring on public behavioral, patterns to design better in terms of furniture, in terms of landscaping or something like this? Yeah, thank you.
Can you just clarify when you mean, so for our main streets, how we're connecting them to the parks or?
Yeah, to the neighborhoods around it.
So in the city of Calgary, we have there's 24 main streets that are scattered. And so the idea is that they would serve different neighborhoods. I'll be honest, when we were we're starting to collect the data and understanding what each main street and who they're serving, we're starting to see gaps. And so there is actually an opportunity for us to go back and consider where do we need to add more main streets. They were predetermined through our municipal development plan and our Calgary transportation plan based on a couple of criterias, that there was primary transit, that we also, they were of a certain corridor size. And so they weren't necessarily intended to connect our open spaces. However, what we're finding is that in some of the conversations, it might trigger other investments to those open spaces. And so we actually have a couple of parallel programs. We have the Established Area Growth and Change program where funding could be available for the community to enact that. But I think the other key piece was we are starting to utilize our, I'll say we're taking back the streets from the cars. And so we're redistributing that percentage that many of the panelists here discussed for other uses besides automobiles. And so we, by definition, are kind of extending and creating those green fingers out throughout our neighborhoods. And so that's why it's interesting that when you kind of poll the people in the community, they want trees. And I think you can infer that that's also because they're kind of feeling that gap or that need for green and open space.
I can answer from the City of Edmonton perspective. Thank you for the question, because it's you're bang on. It's like we got to connect the main streets to the rest of the people who actually live around there. But the other point is, with, as I mentioned, city plan that the city created a few years ago, is the focus is trying to get more residential development along our main streets as well, which the City of Edmonton didn't really focus on in the past. A lot of the focus was on our existing residential neighborhoods and infilling projects, but it neglected our major arterial roads to a point. So now with our new city plan, that's the focus, right? It's not about building a few houses infilling in a residential neighborhood that's already existing. It's about trying to up the game along our major arterial roads, getting apartments, getting townhouses, different mixed use developments along there, taking advantage of the existing public transit that already exists and the connectivity, all the infrastructure that we already have to start. And as I mentioned in my presentation about suburbs, right? A lot of our suburban areas aren't very well connected. We have the main street, but then to get to the main street, you have to drive sometimes, which is not the way it should be. And so that's what with city plan is now we're trying to focus to fill in some of those gaps, get those connections through existing parks, as I mentioned before, rec centers and other things that we already have, linking all those things so it's easy to walk or bike to your main street and then take advantage of the facilities that are there already, and obviously in providing more. So hopefully I answered your question.
I think, are we okay to answer the second question? I know you're like an academic. You asked 5 questions in one, but are we good for that? Okay, awesome.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. So for specifically for Stephen Avenue, and you're asking engagement around design of some of the furniture that might go in on the street, and then also our data collection process for the project. The City of Calgary has a really strong framework for engagement, and we've been working with that since we started the project in 2018, and married that also with some of Gail's public life, public space study methods to really build the future transformation and redesign of the avenue on evidence, both in terms of what we could see and observe and also what we heard from people, and that's continuously being built into the design process. So all our designs is a response to what we've heard, and that's weaved into the public process and the documents. Specifically for the furniture, like we're in the master planning phase, so the actual sort of design of the specific components, it's still more about like the structure and the division of the space and where things go. But we've had, there's been an interim phase, which was between phase 1 and 2, phase 1B, called Activate and Experiments, which actually had a series of pilot projects implemented on the avenue. And that was used to sort of push the thinking around what type of furniture, what type of social furniture can we think about for the future of Stephen Avenue for the permanent redesign that might enable user groups that we're not seeing today to spend time. And that was married also with some projects that implemented a pollinator garden and also a winter activation design competition where local groups actually got things through a design competition built on the street. So this has been an important part of the process because we've actually learned, you know, or been able to debunk some myths, maybe I should say, instead of us coming in as professionals and saying, we know if we put in this kind of furniture, you might see teenagers, or if you put in this kind of program, you might see families. We've actually shown that that is the case through some of these pilot projects that the city have led. And specifically, like one set of furnishing that invited teens to spend time, which was an audience that we didn't really see much in our baseline design, data evaluation. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, great. I encourage you, if you have other questions, to corner the panelists and ask them your questions throughout the rest of today and tomorrow if they're around. So one big round of applause, and we're going to move into a little bit of an energizer before our next session. So great work.